They even, if you can believe it, they eat their own exoskeletons after molting. And they're highly attracted to certain kinds of crops like alfalfa and wheat, especially if they're irrigated. They also can eat weedy grasses like cheatgrass. And when they're on rangelands, non-crop lands, they prefer forbs or flowering plants to grasses and to shrubs, although they will also eat those too. So often they will be seen on flowers eating high protein tissues of the flowers, such as the flower, the seed pod, the seeds themselves. This is showing them on balsam root, the heads, or on crepus. These are photos from Idaho. They also like the foliage of legumes because they're nitrogen rich. So here's a photo of lupin, which is a favorite plant of theirs, and yellow sweet clover, which is a non-native plant that they also really like. So you can see that they're really widely adaptable, which makes sense when you think about the really harsh, demanding and unforgiving environment of the Great Basin and also the Intermountain West. So, given that they eat so much and they're in such huge bands, don't they like destroy the rangeland? They actually, believe it or not, don't do much damage when they're on rangeland. And this is partly because they move, they just keep moving. So, any one area might only be occupied for a couple of days. And typically, plants on rangelands can recover from the feeding they do get. Now, there have been a few bad cycles in our past where range damage was severe. But scientists who examined the record argued that actually, when that happened, this coincided with periods of severe drought and overgrazing. So it wasn't attributable only to Mormon crickets, which is great news when we think about these being native insects on rangelands. Now they are also cannibalistic. They cannibalize each other and this can include and another Mormon cricket that's just molted. It could include another Mormon cricket that is wounded from maybe having been hit by a car when crossing the road. It can include already dead Mormon crickets. And because of the constant threat of cannibalism, some scientists have likened, I find this really poetic, but their migrations to a forced march for protein and salt. I mean, maybe not poetic, maybe like scary, actually, when you think about it. Um, they prefer protein and salt when they need food. And so, like one observation, speaking to their salt needs, Mormon crickets have been known to consume soil that is soaked in cattle urine. So that's a good source of salt. I can hear you saying, ooh, gross, but keep with me because they have some other really interesting behaviors. So let's look at the courtship and mating. So they're kind of different from a lot of insects because when they have high densities, the males actually select the females, and this is different from most insects. They actually make something called a nuptial gift to females. It's not an engagement ring. It is a large blob of protein that you can see right here. It actually is so large that it can constitute 27% of the male's body weight when he gives it to her. And it contains the sperm itself, which make its way into the to female, but the females consume the rest of it. It actually has a lot of protein, and females will they'll copulate in succession with multiple males, is my understanding. And the number of eggs that she ends up producing is related to the number of spermatophores, that's what this is called, that she receives and eats. So this really contributes to her reproductive fitness. And the fact that the males go into this big investment essentially into the female, which ultimately means higher reproductive fitness. This is really like an evolutionary advantage when you're thinking about really constrained resource availability, again, in these harsh environments of the Nevada deserts, the Great Basin, and the Intermountain West. Another really interesting feature is that the embryos can remain dormant for years. So the females, they lay their eggs during the summer, The eggs are shown here on this penny, so they're pretty small, about the size of a grain of rice. And they don't hatch until the following spring when it starts to warm up. The date of hatching varies. It can be, around the beginning of April. It can sometimes be as early as January. But usually it's going to be somewhere in that early spring time. And after the eggs are laid in the soil, they actually begin to develop into embryos. So thinking back to like high school biology, when we learned about embryonic development, the fertilized egg starts to divide and it very quickly forms this blastula or this ball of cells that is sort of like a sphere. And that is something that happens before the winter comes. When the Mormon cricket eggs start to develop in the soil, they form the blastula stage. And they actually can develop much further than that before the winter comes. But then they go into an arrested state where all development then stops. They're sort of halfway developed and they just stop. And that's because winter is coming. And during the winter, they just wait. And this phase again is called diapause. And then they finish developing and they hatch out in the spring. But a lot of Mormon crickets, they actually cease their development earlier at this blastula stage, and they can spend years in this blastula stage. So this is pretty amazing. It's kind of like thinking about a seed that can just stay in the seed bank in the soil for years and still develop when the conditions are right. And again, I love to think about sort of the evolutionary adaptations of all of these behaviors and physiologies. And the explanation that has been given for this kind of life history is that this prolonged diapause sort of spreads out the time of hatching so that maybe eggs from the same female might actually develop and hatch out in different years. And so when you think about it, that spreads the risk out of all of her offspring hatching out maybe in a bad year where they might all die really soon after hatching out. So again, this is like insurance, really interesting behavior. So all in all, I view these Mormon crickets as really highly adaptive animals who have evolved to make the best of a really harsh, unpredictable environment. Essentially, when you think about it, they're turning rock and heat and salt into this abundance. So who makes use of this? Well, lots and lots of animals. So let's look at a few examples. So I want to start with the Mormon settlers. In 1848, there were 1,700 Mormons who had just arrived along the Great Salt Lake. They had planted crops on 5,000 acres of land, and they had high hopes. But what happened? Well, I'm going to take the time to read this because it's so well written and it's so interesting. So, this is written by Orson Whitney, who was one of the leaders at the time. But now came a visitation as terrible as it was totally unexpected. It was the cricket plague in May and June of that year. An army of famine and despair rolled in black legions down the mountainsides and attacked the fields of growing grain. The tender crops fell an easy prey to their fierce voracity. They literally swept everything before them. Starvation, with all of its terrors, seemed staring the poor settlers in the face. And then, when it seemed that nothing could stay the devastation, great flocks of gulls appeared, filling the air with their white wings and plaintive cries, and settled down upon the half-ruined fields. All day long they gorged themselves, and when full, disgorged and feasted again, the white gulls upon the black crickets, like hosts of heaven and hell contending, until the pests were vanquished and the people were saved. So I find that very emotional almost and so interesting. And, um, this is part of the origin story of Mormons in Salt Lake City, but this has been observed multiple times since. And now we know just how many crickets or grasshoppers gulls are capable of cleaning up. One study showed that a single California gull collected in an Alberta pasture had 538 large grasshoppers in its digestive tract. And so this is a really amazing ability that these gulls have. And because gulls literally helped save the Mormons from starving their first year, they are honored in Temple Square in Salt Lake City. So insects are really important in the diet of most bird species, especially during the breeding period, and they're especially critical food for the nestlings, the juvenile birds. So let's look at western meadowlark. This is considered the ablest avian predator of the Mormon cricket by L.A. Rivers, excuse me, La Rivers. He was a naturalist that worked at the University of Nevada back in the early to mid 20th century. And he wrote about the western meadowlarks, really reporting on how they specialized upon the eggs of the Mormon cricket. Again, when you think about it, when you can attack the egg stage of a pest species, that's really the most effective way to keep its numbers in check. But western meadowlarks have also been studied for how many grasshoppers they consume. And the estimate is that practically 80,000 grasshoppers per square mile. I can't remember if this is an individual or a pair, but in either way, it's just an enormous number. And when grasshoppers or crickets are abundant, these are 96% of a western meadowlark diet. So they're really important predators on orthopterans and Mormon crickets. Also, there's the raven. There was a raven that was collected, and inside its digestive tract were 285 Mormon cricket eggs, and also three mature Mormon crickets. So this is another pretty amazing feat of predation. We also have kestrels. This is a beautiful bird, a favorite bird of mine. These birds will hover over bands of Mormon crickets and they'll track their movements from the sky and come down to feed on them. And they're really important food. Kestrels will focus on orthopterans, and some studies have found that up to 60% of the adult food is orthopterans, and for nestlings, orthopterans are even more important, up to 72%. What about passerines? Let's look at two sparrows of the sage steppe, brewery sparrow and sagebrush sparrow. Now, for their nestlings, these and other passerines rely on a whole variety of different insects, but grasshoppers and crickets comprise the largest percentage of the biomass for the nestling food overall, with beetles and butterfly and moth caterpillars close behind. So they are, capable of diversifying, but these are just sort of basic staple foods for passerines. There's lots more birds. I don't have time to get into, but I just want to show you this list from La Rivers again, that University of Nevada naturalist. He documented dozens of birds preying upon Mormon crickets and lots of different families. We've got raptors, we've got grouse, we've got owls, we've got woodpeckers, we've got corvids, and we've got lots and lots of passerines. Moving on from birds, it's not just birds, but we've also got fish, we've got coyotes, we've got small rodents, we've got reptiles that all prey upon Mormon crickets. I want to talk just a minute about the humpback chub shown in the middle here. This is a Colorado fish, river fish. It basically, along with some other endemic fish of the Colorado River, is considered a voracious feeder on Mormon crickets. It was observed in Dinosaur National Monument during a Mormon cricket outbreak. All these fish that were native and a bunch of non-native fish as well within the river system just engorged with Mormon crickets during an outbreak in the 1980s. Now, the authors of this paper noticed that the crickets coincide with the time right before the humpback chub reproduce. And they speculated, about how adaptive this is for these fish. And they also noticed that a lot of these Colorado River fish, they're really long-lived. And they wrote that periodic outbreaks of Mormon crickets might contribute significantly to their nutrition over their long lives, because These are things that show up in real abundance. But they also notice that, we've changed these rivers a lot. We don't have the same kind of floodplains. Those have been, in some cases, taken over with agriculture, or there's flood control. And so that reduces the inputs into the river. And so they felt that maybe Mormon crickets are even more important now than historically. By the way, since that account was written, this humpback chub is even more imperiled than it used to be. It's actually disappeared from the area that it was observed in during that time. So there are also insect predators, and what we would call natural enemies, on Mormon crickets. We don't know as much about these generally as people because they're so hard to observe, but they're definitely out there. And among them, we include wasps. There's both predatory wasps that sort of kill the individuals and eat them right away. And there's also parasitoid wasps. And the wasp featured here is a type of predatory wasp. Now, wasps sting, as we all know, and these wasps will sting the Mormon crickets. It will paralyze the cricket, and then this wasp drags it into its burrow, which is in the soil. And there it's kept as a food item for the larvae for the next generation. So that's how it serves these thread-waisted wasps. Now, parasitoid wasps are a little different. They're very small. They're often not noticed by most people. They are a bit sneakier in the way that they live. I kind of love their story too. Essentially, the female inserts her eggs directly into the Mormon cricket eggs that she finds in the soil. And then her eggs hatch inside the Mormon cricket eggs, and they start to devour the Mormon cricket egg as it's trying to develop. So talk about insidious. So I hope you're seeing my point. Mormon crickets are really inseparable from the biodiversity of the Great Basin. And, this brings to mind John Muir's quote, which is, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. Whoops, clicked too many times there. So truly, when we stop to really think about the harsh environments in the Great Basin, the presence of a prey item in abundance like Mormon crickets is really, in some ways, a small miracle for the birds and the fish and the mammals and the lizards and the insects that inhabit these really extreme environments. And ecologists have started to come up with a concept for what they call a resource pulse. This is defined as sort of a brief, infrequent event of high resource availability. And an example from other ecosystems that you might be familiar with is the salmon returns to the rivers in the Northwest and Alaska and California, these enormous returns of salmon that come periodically, basically once a year. But these salmon have been out in the ocean for 5 years, and they literally come and they die in the rivers once they've made it to their natal stream. And they serve as food for so many things, who scavenge upon these dead fish. Periodical cicadas, that's another example of a resource pulse. We don't see them for 17 years. And then, like clockwork, they emerge in huge numbers. I don't know what preys on them because I've never really studied them. They're Eastern species. I remember them from childhood, actually. But they illustrate the point. And Mormon crickets and grasshoppers that outbreak are another example of these resource pulses that support hundreds of other animal species. When ecologists have studied these, they find that the consumer species population, in other words, whatever sort of like um, thrives and lives off this resource pulse, whether it's predator, um, or in some cases, resource pulses are not necessarily eaten, but I won't go into these other examples. But these consumer species population can increase, and there can be persistent effects even at the community level. So I think it's a really important concept for thinking about Mormon crickets and grasshoppers within these communities that they evolved in. So lots of biodiversity benefits, but unfortunately, Mormon crickets are also feared, and especially by farmers, because remember the Mormon experience when they first arrived? Mormon crickets do like irrigated crops and they can turn into a problem. So we have federal and in some states, state or county suppression programs to kill Mormon crickets and grasshoppers. And this is sort of an annual program that occurs on thousands to hundreds of thousands of acres of the West each year. So in this next section, I'll describe those programs. And I want to be clear because our mission is about protecting the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. And these programs can put a lot of insecticide on public lands with a lot of native habitat. So we've invested quite a bit of time and energy into studying these programs and trying to figure out the risks. So the federal government they're sort of the biggest player in these programs. They've been overseeing um, uh, a, basically a suppression program since the 1930s for grasshoppers and Mormon crickets in this area of the West, basically rangelands in the West. And the agency that's responsible is located within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's APHIS, or the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. And pictured here are just two of the approximately 15 to 24 different species that are targeted by APHIS. Um, these are species that do have the potential to reach damaging levels, the differential grasshopper and the Mormon cricket. So the federal APHIS program operates primarily on federal lands, tribal lands, and also to some extent on private rangelands in the 17 western states. But there's also programs that are sometimes run by states or local governments or even private actors. For example, in the state of Idaho, um, Idaho gives out carbaryl bait to farmers for free so that they could spread that on their lands to kill Mormon crickets. Local governments like weed and pest control districts sometimes organize sprays within their counties or local areas. State of Oregon will reimburse or did a couple of years ago. Landowners who have had problems. So these are organized at multiple levels, but I'm mostly going to focus on the APHIS program as I continue on. So this map shows where the federal program has treated lands with insecticide to kill grasshoppers and crickets. And this map shows treatment areas between 2008 to 2024. So these applications, as you can see, they're sort of concentrated in certain areas. They're mostly aerial sprays that occur in May through July. And they usually occur on federal lands, but sometimes tribal lands and sometimes private lands or state lands. On average, the spray footprint, according to APHIS, is about 500,000 acres per year, but this can range into millions of acres in a single year. For instance, in 2021 in Montana, APHIS planned to spray more than 2 million acres. They ended up spraying a footprint of about 1.6 million acres that year. And generally, in this purple area, this is where grasshoppers are usually the main target. And in this red area, this is usually where Mormon crickets are the main target. Now, Mormon crickets can be treated with baits more easily than some grasshoppers, but most of these that you're seeing are still aerial sprays that are occurring in larger blocks. There's 4 insecticides that APHIS is authorized to use. The majority that they actually use right now are these two, diflubenzuron and carbaryl. Diflubenzuron works on the juvenile stages and the eggs. It can be somewhat moderately persistent. It can stick to terrestrial vegetation. Carbaryl is an older chemical. It is a nervous system toxin. It is considered highly toxic to honeybees. It's applied mostly as a bait right now, but it can be used sometimes as a liquid spray. I won't talk about these others because they're really not used right now, although chlorantraniliprole is sort of waiting in the wings. We don't know. if it will become more important in the future. So Nevada is 87% public land, federal public land, and a lot of that is used for livestock grazing. For the portion of the state that is agriculture, alfalfa and other hay crops are the primary crops found in Nevada. There are some row crops, potatoes, things like some small grains. Teff is even becoming more important, which is really interesting. It's a small grain that is used in Ethiopian food, and I use it as breakfast cereal. But anyway, the state runs a survey program to track the density of Mormon crickets. And this shows the results of their survey last year. They basically did their surveys, from what I can tell, just in northern Nevada, usually following main roadways. And the red areas are where Mormon crickets were more than two per square yard. The green areas is where there was zero, and the yellow areas where the densities were in between. So mainly they were finding higher densities around Elko last year, as they have been for a few years. This shows where treatments have occurred in Nevada over basically since 2021. This map shows between 21 and 2024, all the places that were treated. Basically, again, near Elko, but also here in Northwest Nevada. And these red blocks are where mostly aerial sprays occurred to kill off Mormon crickets. Now, last year, this is the area that was treated again, kind of near Elko. And it doesn't look like a whole lot right here, but this is an area, a footprint of almost 400 square miles within these blocks. So it's more than it appears. And a lot of this was on public land, most of it on federal public land. Now, I do have to say in Nevada, APHIS does something that I haven't seen other states do, which is they use less per acre than what other states are doing. So that's good because less is going out. It's effective. They're using diflubenzuron here. They're basically skipping a little bit more of the area each time. But it's still putting toxic insecticides on the land on some fairly large acreages. Now, as I mentioned, we're interested in conservation, and insecticides are essentially compounds that are designed to kill insects. So, we recognize that insecticides are part of our cultural way of growing food. But what are the effects to non-targets? And how do we distinguish between applications where we might have more concern than others? What are the red flags that we might have for bigger effects? Well, if the pesticide is in widespread use or over a large area, or the pesticide moves off site easily, and in this case, across the APHIS program as a whole, we do have concerns about this because almost all the applications are aerial, liquid insecticides. There's a lot of drift with that, which means that the pesticide is moving off site. These are large areas in any particular year. And then the spray activity is occurring basically at the time of year when everything is blooming, when all the insects are out. So there's a lot of overlap with non-target species like bees, butterflies, beetles, etc. And that's a concern. If the spray could occur in the wintertime when nothing was out, it'd be really different. But in this case, it's not. We also ask ourselves, how toxic is this chemical? And in this case, it varies by insecticide, those 4 allowed insecticides. The preferred insecticide now, diflubenzuron, is not nearly as toxic as what they used to use more often, but that doesn't mean that it's not a problem. In fact, we really have a lot of concern about bumblebees because there have been lab studies showing that bumblebees are quite sensitive to this chemical, even at very, very low levels within the realm of what's being put out there. And then how persistent are these chemicals? Do they break down quickly in the environment? And this is sort of a mixed bag with these aphis chemicals. The carbaryl doesn't last all that long. The diflubenzuron lasts longer, and chlorantraniliprole, which they're not using yet, as far as I know, really can last a long time. So we do have concerns. We've got things meeting these red flags, and we will continue to keep an eye on this program. I talked about pollinators. This is something that we spend a lot of time, researching, understanding, and communicating about. In the West and especially in the Southwest, we've got really high pollinator diversity, including in Nevada. Nevada's home to more than 1,000 species of native bees, and more than 200 species of butterflies. They're actually number 8 in the nation for the number of species of butterflies. I say they because I'm not there in Nevada with you. I live in Oregon. But yeah, you've got really high biodiversity for pollinators in your state. So let's talk about reducing reliance on insecticides. First of all, if you have Mormon crickets come into your area, how can you protect your garden or home or small farm with non-chemical solutions? Well, physical barriers are your friend. If you've just got a few plants that you want to protect, you could put row covers over them or what I call rame, basically. I can't remember, basically row cover cloth. You want to attach it to the ground so that, the Mormon crickets can't get under it. Another way that's recommended, and this is actually an image I had to generate in ChatGPT, so it's not very realistic, but it does illustrate the main point here is that staking an area and then putting plastic up about 2 feet up actually creates a pretty good barrier that Mormon crickets mostly can't get over. They don't have a good way of sticking to plastic. And again, if you have a smaller farm, a home, you could put something like this up pretty quickly and protect yourself if you know that they're coming to your area and you need to protect your garden. Biologically, if you're worried about them coming into your home, make sure your screens are in good condition. Your weather stripping is keeping insects from coming between those gaps between the door and the jamb. Um, Biologically, you can, continue to support birds and other predators by maintaining, diversity on your landscape, and native species that are already, good foods for birds and other wildlife. Turkey and chickens and guinea fowl are really avid predators. And if you have the space, like if you have a small farm, or you've got backyard chickens, these can be really helpful, to protect your property. You can turn the soil in your garden over to desiccate any eggs that might have been laid. So that's a few practices that you can do. So we've been focusing on this program, and we're especially fighting large-scale applications to public lands. So if you want to help with this, I want to give you a little bit of information about what we've been doing and how you can help. So first of all, we've been standing up for sound, what we call, sound integrated pest management and public disclosure. We actually won a federal lawsuit showing that APHIS's environmental impact statement and 4 of its state level environmental assessments violated NEPA. So APHIS will be redoing its environmental impact statement and these state level environmental assessments as a result. Essentially, the judge ruled that they weren't focusing enough on prevention, and that was a violation of not only NEPA, but also the Food Quality and Protection Act. So we also really advocate for protections of special places and species. And this is something that has actually resulted in millions of acres of new protection for federally designated lands. This is especially true in Idaho and Nevada, and to a more limited extent, other places where APHIS is recognizing, yeah, you know what? we can, say that wilderness study areas are off limits or areas of critical environmental concern. We don't really need to spray within those areas. So this is something that we've been continuing to advocate for. We do feel that more areas need more protection, especially aquatic areas. We don't feel like the current protections for watersheds and aquatic areas are sufficient. We also want to see better protections for threatened and endangered species, which have been weakened in some cases recently. We also help local communities be aware of pending sprays, and this has resulted in local communities being more engaged and even in some cases forcing the federal and state agencies to retract plans in areas that were really special for the local community. And we bring awareness, just like through presentations like this, to audiences. This is so important so that people learn more about these programs. So on public lands, what are we asking for? Well, we want sustainable solutions and those prevention approaches first. As I mentioned in our lawsuit, that was what was missing from the current APHIS program. And we're hopeful that in the new environmental impact statement, that APHIS will really grapple with this in a substantive way. We also want increased transparency. We want APHIS to disclose more information about when they're spraying, why they're spraying, what the environmental monitoring is, and also to engage the public up front to keep the public engaged and tribes as well. We would like to continue to have sensitive areas and species protected from pesticides. We know that some places really are high biodiversity areas and really should be protected from sprays, that water is so important in the West, listed species, and so on. And then for targeted applications, this is a tough one because it really means more investment needs to go in up front on, monitoring and figuring out ways that pest populations can be, attacked in an earlier stage and not have to have pesticides spread across such broad areas. There's research that's needed here. There's, a lot of work that's needed, but this is what we're advocating for. What about on private lands? Well, we also advocate for sustainable solutions on private lands, and I'm not going to pretend it's easy, and especially for those large irrigated farms, but there are ways to try to limit Mormon cricket damage. Remember, these are flightless animals, and they tend to move through a landscape faster. And so there are some solutions that Extension Services recommend to reduce reliance on insecticides. And some of these are utilized for grasshoppers as well, but resistant crops where available. There are some crop species that are less susceptible to certain grasshoppers. I don't really know if there are resistant crops right now for Mormon crickets. Seeding, timing and rate, harvest timing, tillage to destroy eggs, biological control with poultry. There are accounts of, large grain farms that have poultry, garlic farms, actually that are resistant. And then, of course, attracting natural enemies with habitat. In pastures, it's really important not to overgraze and allow grasses to recover because remember that Mormon crickets are going to move through. They're not going to spend that long, but the grasses need time to recover. If those areas have not already been overgrazed to begin with, there's a chance these grasses can recover. And then barrier approaches, because again, these are flightless insects that are moving along on the ground. So targeted and barrier approaches, that means making sure that there's thresholds met before a treatment, but you can use barrier approaches along the edges of fields. Trap strips can concentrate the bands, and then you can treat a small area rather than the entire field. So these are some techniques that we think are important for private lands. So if you want to stay engaged, we would love to have your engagement. You can participate in quarterly organizing meetings. You can sign up at this QR code. You can take a photo of that with your phone if you like, or you can use this URL, which if you took a photo of that, I'm sure you can't write it down all that fast. But You can also monitor what's happening in Nevada. You can engage with BLM offices to stay abreast of treatment plans, and you can get the word out to others about how important Mormon crickets really are in our landscape and that we need more sustainable solutions. So if you think that you want to reach out to BLM and make your views known, consider, the leverage that you have in terms of what BLM can decide and so on. First of all, they can decide whether to request a spray or not. APHIS won't spray unless BLM agrees to it. They can put stipulations and limitations on sprays. So you can ask if you've got special areas, you don't want sprayed, or you want to see certain species better protected. You could talk to BLM and ask for these things. Now, they also have certain internal processes and policies that they need to abide by that include the sensitive species policy. They can make decisions on NEPA adequacy. They need to write pesticide use proposals. As a concerned citizen, you can ask for these processes to be abided by. You can ask to see copies of these and so on. So these are ways you can engage with BLM and make sure that they're doing their job in the best possible way as a multi-use agency. What we can ask for is, again, areas off limits to protect special species and places. Again, we've got good models already in Idaho and in Nevada. And then transparency, as I talked about before, that would include, that public engagement, but also notification and public facing maps. We're really not seeing that before areas get sprayed. And then the treatments be focused more narrowly, that thresholds be used, environmental monitoring. So these are a few things that can be asked for. And if you decide to engage with BLM, these are some things you can use. So that's all I've got. And I would just want to say thank you so much to all of you and to our supporters that really make this possible. We've got so many members who support the work that we do and foundations, and we could not do this work without the funders and the members that make our work possible. And we're always happy to have more members. If you want to become a member, you can join us at this link. And I just want to say thank you for your time and attention tonight, for coming to this presentation. If you've got questions that don't get answered in the Q&A, you can always contact me at pesticides@xerces.org. And thank you again. So I'm going to stop sharing. And
thank you so much, Sharon. I know you can't see everybody, but we have about 40 people in here, and we all really enjoyed that presentation. It was really engaging and informative. So thank you.
Great. Okay.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna open it up for questions if anybody here has any. And on Zoom, if you want to type in the chat, I can relay those as well to the group here.
How toxic is that for humans? Those pesticides.
So, we have a question. How toxic are these pesticides to humans?
Okay. Diflubenzuron, which is the most commonly used chemical, is not really toxic. There's some concern about inhalation for firefighters if they end up burning a place that still has some residue, but for the most part, that's really not a concern. Carbaryl, which is the second most commonly sprayed, is a concern if it's sprayed by liquid, or if it was ingested by people or pets. It is as I mentioned, like it works on the nervous system. We have basically some of the same neural pathways. And it's actually considered a potential human carcinogen. So carbaryl is not a good thing for to be, close to, but diflubenzuron I would not worry about from a human health perspective.
I have another question about the order that Mormon crickets are in. So you said that this order is primarily herbivores, like on all the continents that are covered by ice, but Mormon crickets have such a high like dietary variety is this an evolutionary adaptation specific to the family that Mormon crickets are in, or the species, because of like environmental limitations in the desert? Or is this something that you see in different families or species in this order commonly?
Did you hear that?
I was kind of long-winded. Yeah.
No, I think I got it. I think I got it. I think that's a great question. I'm not totally sure I have the answer, but as I as I think through it, and I think I expressed sort of my views, and again, different scientists have sort of looked at these scientific adaptations and stuff. I do think Mormon crickets might be um, more omnivorous, and then, including eating animal food because of the harsh environment that they live in compared to a lot of other grasshoppers. You know, we have somebody who is attending who is also studying Mormon crickets. Um, and I just want to invite Lee, if you want to speak up on any of these questions, I invite you to weigh in because you may have looked into this more. She's had an opportunity to work with some of the um, notable Mormon cricket scientists directly. So,
Who's Lee?
oh,
Zoom. Lee's on Zoom.
Oh, does she have permission to speak?
I think, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I think so, right?
She should. Yeah.
Okay.
She may have hopped off. I don't see her.
You may have. Yeah, yeah.
I definitely
Okay.
saw her earlier, but yeah.
Okay. Okay. But anyway, so yeah, I would have liked to have her weigh in on that. But I think that's the way I look at it. But it's not a hard and fast rule, I guess. So yeah, I'm sorry to not have a great answer to your question.
Alan has a question.
Are these large mass breakouts, as you call them, of the crickets? These mass breakouts of the crickets, are they annual? Do they occur every year and at the same intensity, or do they fluctuate from year to year?
Yeah. They fluctuate from year to year. And Mormon crickets are often said to like go in cycles, like where a cycle might last 5 years, 15 years even. There were, I don't know, maybe 10 years in the 1980s when women crickets were kind of a repeating problem in parts of the West. I don't remember if Nevada was affected as much then, but I know Colorado was, Utah. Um, right now, this current outbreak has lasted about 5 years. I think it was not quite as there weren't quite as many crickets. And they were definitely concentrated around Elko, but every year they might, be popping out in a slightly different place. So, and that is sort of, what we see with grasshoppers too, is that there's areas that tend to be hot spots like year after year, but they're very sporadic, that you can't count on any area being a place where an outbreak is going to occur every single year. They move around the landscape, and every year can be different because climate plays a role in, the overwintering survival and how well they do in the early spring as well. So,
Awesome. Thank you. Here, Al. All of them.
This is probably a silly question, but I know that in many countries, people actually do eat insects.
yes.
Are Mormon crickets good to eat?
I wish I knew myself, but and I
Well, can you find out?
well, I mean, I actually was planning on mentioning that and I forgot because when you think about it again, like I was giving you examples of wildlife that utilize this tremendous resource, but you know, Indians, the native people of Nevada, they were also relying on Mormon crickets. They would roast them and utilize them for food. They would, I think if I recall correctly, pulverize them and make flour out of them, and then later, mix that with liquids and make that into kind of a cake. They would bake that. So, Mormon crickets have also been sort of floated as an idea for chicken feed and basically poultry feed to be collected and used as feed, which honestly I think is a great idea. Like if we can make use of these outbreaks rather than, spreading insecticide around, I mean, I think that's a win-win. But people did eat, co-evolved on this landscape, consuming Mormon crickets because it was an abundant food. So why not? So in our modern culture, obviously, we've got all these sort of like cultural, things, hang-ups, I think I'll call them, that sort of get in the way.
Cultural inhibitions.
Yeah, exactly. But they're nutritious. There's a lot of protein. There's a lot of fat in them. Really, if you were going to be out there, say backpacking in the desert or something and ran out of food, I would not hesitate to eat Mormon crickets. I'd eat them in a heartbeat.
Would they, would
Pardon
they
me?
taste good if they were covered in chocolate?
Uh, I think so. I would guess yes.
We had another question over here.
Well,
Okay.
actually, I think that was sort of, it's already answered. I was gonna ask you about the encounters of native peoples before the Mormons with the Mormon crickets, and you did really answered that, I think.
I'm not sure if I heard that clearly.
Well, my
Uh-huh.
question was about, the encounters of native peoples with the crickets, with
Oh.
the Mormons, and so you already covered a lot of that, but is there within the cultural memory or within the customs of native peoples that there's, ideas about Mormon crickets or tales about encounters with Mormon crickets? That's what I was.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I don't know if it's the microphone, but I'm hearing part of what you're saying, but it's breaking up enough. I'm not fully sure if I'm getting it. You're asking about
Yeah.
customs? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
she was asking if there's like important cultural stories about Mormon crickets or like documented like importance of Mormon crickets to indigenous people before colonization, if you had any information about that.
Oh yeah, there definitely is. I'd be happy to send a paper that I've got that describes that. Yeah, there's definitely information. I think that there's an archaeological site where they have um, basically fossilized, I guess, Mormon crickets like in large numbers, like with fire and everything. So I think maybe there's petroglyphs or things so that they knew that this was an area. But yeah, there's definitely been some work on this. Um,
That's cool.
yeah, yeah.
Anybody else? Yeah, Bruce, I'm gonna come over to you really quick.
Do we have any idea about how the populations have changed since human settlement and beginning of agriculture in the Great Basin?
That is such a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. Um, I can tell you with grasshoppers, throughout the West, there's 400 species. Obviously, Mormon crickets are a type of grasshopper, essentially, but um, every species is slightly different in terms of adaptations and all of that. There was a study, well, not a study, there was an incredibly fascinating book written by a former grasshopper scientist at University of Wyoming, and he studied grasshoppers because of, the pest status in the West, but he became very interested in this pest locust species that existed basically at the time of European American settlement when pioneers were coming across the West. And those early decades, there were some enormous grasshopper outbreaks. This was actually a species called the Rocky Mountain locust. And this locust was quite devastating. I mean, just really affected a lot of these small farms and new towns and all this stuff. But by 1902, the species was extinct. So there was like less than 50 years of experience in the pioneer era with this species before it was gone. So this scientist at University of Wyoming studied it, and among other things, he sort of figured out why it went extinct. It wasn't because of insecticides, although, they had their ways of using insecticides back in those days, not as effectively as we can, but it was because basically the area where it needed to breed and overwinter, as I recall, like had basically been plowed up for agriculture, and it was a very tight space in these mountain valleys in the Rockies. And so incredibly, this thing that was like on the scale of passenger pigeon, and he, went extinct within 50 years. This one species was so abundant that he actually, I don't know how he did this. I can't remember how he did these calculations. And I think he was a good enough scientist that I trust these numbers. But he calculated what he believed the biomass of this Rocky Mountain locust to be and compared it to the bison biomass pre-settlement. So he calculated that bison occupied 11 million tons of biomass, if I recall. This might be metric tons. And the Rocky Mountain locust was 8 million tons. So we all know like how abundant bison were on the central plains and to imagine that one grasshopper species had almost as much biomass, it's absolutely astounding to me. So I think there's evidence to show that some of the habitats that have been messed up, like annual grasses, weeds, weedy habitats in the Intermountain West, have made certain grasshopper problems worse. That irrigated croplands can really attract things like Mormon crickets. But I don't think that we really have, when you look across all these species, like we don't, I think, have any evidence that like things, the grasshoppers are wholly worse off or better off as a result of humans being on the landscape. We know that some species are limited and in fact declining. Other species seem to be expanding. So it's a complicated picture.
One more question. When nighttime comes, I can hear crickets chirping out in the yard and so on. I can hear grasshoppers making noise even during the day. Are Mormon crickets also, do they make any kind of sound, or are they silent? And if they do make a sound, can you identify them by that sound?
Yes. Now, I'm not sure about those sounds, but I do know that grasshoppers, some of them make sounds and it's a sound that's used in mating, and that they're unique. They're unique. So I think the Mormon crickets, if they make noise, that is probably also unique, but I'm not familiar with their sound. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharon. Oh, okay, sorry. One more.
Okay.
Is there any quantitative evidence of how many birds are being poisoned by eating Mormon crickets that have been exposed to pesticides?
Yeah, I think the indirect effect of a potentially diminished food resource is the issue that I think is maybe more relevant, mainly because the birds themselves are not very sensitive to the chemical that's most often used, which is diflubenzuron. And but the fact that the populations are being actively suppressed can potentially impact the populations just because they have a a food source that is not as abundant as might have been. So I think in the excuse me, and 50 years ago when they were using more toxic chemicals, we did have some evidence that some of those chemicals were actually poisonous to some of the birds. And luckily, for the most part, APHIS has transitioned away from using some of those more toxic chemicals. But we still are worried about impacts to the food supply. At least I am.
All right. Thank you so much, Sharon. We really appreciate you answering all of our questions, and everybody was really engaged, had a lot of questions. So that means you did a really good job. So yeah,
Well,
just thank you so much.
thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to have been here tonight. I'm glad it worked, and I really encourage you if you want to get in touch and stay engaged, please do. And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.